Good evening and welcome to our hybrid conversation this evening, Who Benefits? USAID and the Strategic Role of U.S. Foreign Assistance. My name is Dawn Carey and I serve as the Senior Associate Director at the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding, leading our Global Health and Development pillar. A couple of notes on process before I introduce today's conversation. We'll be taking questions from both the audience here in the room and online. If you are online, I strongly suggest you pose your questions as you think of them. We have someone who's pulling those together as we shoot the program. In addition, as with any public event, we remind you that Dartmouth and the Dickey Center are committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. With that, we would ask that you do not interfere or disrupt today's program, which would include preventing attendees from seeing or hearing our guests and moderators and/or interfering with our guests and moderators' ability to speak or be heard. Thank you. Our goal this evening is to talk about the role of the U.S. Agency for International Development and Foreign Assistance Programs and what role they've played. We want to open the conversation by also laying out what the Trump administration's policy and actions aim to do, and what the effects may be with the reduction of foreign assistance, including the proposed reduction shutdown of USAID. We will then share our collective understanding of the debate over aid programs from different vantage points, including an overview of what AID traditionally has done and a consideration of what might happen next. This panel was convened in response to interest in a recent series of executive orders regarding USAID from the White House earlier this year. On January 24th, a State Department memo ordered a halt work for almost every foreign assistance program funded by the United States government for 90 days. Since then, the mandate has shifted numerous times, from some programs allowed to apply for exemption waivers, to employees being locked out of their computers, to placing USAID under the State Department, creating massive layoffs and office closings around the world. As of last Thursday, a federal judge extended a freeze on the Trump administration's plan to place over 2,000 USAID employees on leave. In spite of this freeze, many aid agencies find themselves unable to continue their work, culminating in layoffs and program terminations across the globe. An estimated 52,000 Americans have already lost their jobs because of these actions. By putting these programs on hold, we may risk lives through the lack of infectious disease monitoring and prevention, vaccination programs, disaster relief, and counter-extremism programming. For many people, this is seen as life-saving work. For others, there's no understanding of foreign assistance or how it helps Americans, if it does at all. We hope to broaden the understanding with this panel. We've convened an illustrious panel of Dartmouth-affiliated people to walk us through this discussion, and I'd like to introduce them now. So online, we have first Sarah Charles, class of 2002. Sarah led USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, overseeing U.S. international disaster response, humanitarian aid, and resilience efforts. Previously, she was Senior Director for Policy at the International Rescue Committee, where she worked to reform humanitarian aid and improve policies for refugees and conflict-affected communities. She also served on the National Security Council as Director for Humanitarian Affairs and later as Director for Strategic Planning, coordinating U.S. responses to global crises, including conflicts in Syria, Iraq, South Sudan, the Ebola breakout in West Africa, and the global refugee crisis. Before that, she worked at USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives, leading post-Arab Spring stabilization efforts in the Middle East. Jeremy Horowitz is the Deputy Program Manager for Promoting Impact and Learning with Cost-Effectiveness Evidence at the Center for Effective Global Action. This multi-year initiative aims to expand evidence generation and use at USAID. Prior to joining CEDA, Jeremy was Senior Research Scientist at the National Opinion Research Center, where he led evaluations and research projects on civic engagement, migration, democratic backsliding, and related topics. He also spent several years as a faculty member in the government department at Dartmouth College, where he conducted research and taught courses on elections and policy making in emerging democracies. Our last online panelist, Tim Rieser, class of 76 at Dartmouth, serves as senior advisor for Senator Peter Welch. And he also, prior to that, he was a key advisor to Senator Patrick Leahy since 1985. He also served as Democratic clerk for the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations, playing a significant role in shaping U.S. foreign policy and aid programs. He helped craft the 1998 Leahy Law, which prohibits U.S. military assistance to foreign forces that commit human rights violations without accountability. Rieser also played a critical role in shifting U.S. policy towards Cuba, working to improve diplomatic relations and facilitate humanitarian efforts. He was a key figure in securing the release of USAID contractor Alan Gross from a Cuban prison, further solidifying his influence in international negotiations and human rights advocacy. Here in 041 Haldeman, we have Ambassador Erica Barks-Ruggles. She served 33 years in senior diplomatic roles, including leading the U.S. effort to rejoin UNESCO and reestablish U.S. leadership in education, AI, and cultural preservation. She was the head of delegation to major ITU conferences in 2022 and oversaw U.S. policies at the UN during her time at the Bureau of International Organization Affairs. Previously, she was senior diplomatic scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center and acting chancellor at National Defense University. From 2015 to 2018, she served as U.S. ambassador to Rwanda and held key roles in U.S. diplomacy and international human rights, and is now serving as a Magro Fellow here at the Dickey Center. Dan Lucey, class of 87, Geisel 82, is an American physician, researcher, clinical professor of medicine of infectious disease, and a research associate in anthropology at the Smithsonian, where he's co-organized an exhibition on 8 viral outbreaks. His infectious disease training and MPH were at Harvard after a medical residency at UCSF and med school at Dartmouth and college at Dartmouth. After working with the NIH and Washington Hospital Center, he co-founded a graduate program on emergency infectious diseases and biohazardous threats. He's traveled widely in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East to exchange information regarding infectious diseases such as Ebola, COVID, bird flu, SARS, influenza, Nipah, HIV, anthrax, and MERS, all the diseases. Our last is Tori Holt, serves as the Norman E. McCulloch Jr. Director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth, a role she assumed in 2021. She has a distinguished career in public policy, diplomacy, and international affairs, previously serving as vice president at the Simpson Center and deputy assistant secretary for international security at the State Department. In this role, she oversaw U.S. policy on UN peace operations, sanctions, and counterterrorism, leading diplomatic efforts such as the 2015 Leaders Summit on UN peacekeeping. She's also a scholar and educator, teaching graduate seminars at Columbia University and here at Dartmouth College, and writes extensively on UN peace operations, conflict prevention, and the protection of civilians. With that, Tori, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dawn. We have a wealth of Dartmouth expertise here with a wide range of field experience, diplomatic work, from global health to humanitarian affairs, from serious oversight and looking at measured effectiveness to congressional oversight and the debates that are always raging in Washington about what foreign assistance is for, whether it serves a purpose, American vision of values and interests. And so we very much welcome particularly the students who came to us and said, I don't understand what's going on. Can you help us unpack these issues? And so that really is our purpose tonight. 2 brief things about me, and then I will turn to our ambassador. I did serve in Washington, and what I can say is that for every conflict that we were dealing with, whether it was the Arab Spring in Yemen, what was happening in South Sudan, or the earthquake in Haiti, every meeting in the White House had AID in the room. They were assessing the humanitarian consequences of conflict. They were advising on the way to recover from it. And they were frequently tasked again and again to do everything from humanitarian assistance to think about how do you help a country emerge into more of a democratic situation. So just on a sheer practical level, I have seen them baked into the response the United States designs on a regular basis. At the international level, you can't find a country more generous than the United States in providing international humanitarian development assistance. So if the U.S. holds back on those funds, it doesn't just affect direct U.S. bilateral programs, it has a huge consequence around the world. And then I just want to give Tim Rieser, one of our speakers tonight, a heads up. As a former congressional staffer, I'll be very curious about his perspective on how this debate fits with the usual tug of war between an administration that comes in and sets priorities and how Congress works with them to set appropriations priorities, something that is a well-heralded experience in D.C., and it doesn't seem to be the way that this issue is necessarily being approached. So with that, let me turn first to Erica Barks-Ruggles, our diplomat in residence. You've had a lot of experience both in Washington but specifically in the field. What's your perspective on the role of foreign assistance, in particular USAID?
Yeah, thanks, Tori, and thanks to everybody who's joining us. We just have a huge wealth of expertise, and it's a real honor to be here. Look, we, as you said, AID is a partner with everything we do on the diplomatic front. We cannot do diplomacy without our military. Likewise, we cannot do diplomacy without our AID colleagues. And we need diplomacy because we are the pointy end of the spear. At the end of the day, we're the people who stop conflicts from happening. We prevent them in the first place. We're the ones who negotiate the peace agreements to bring them to an end, and we're the ones who do the reconstruction after a conflict has happened, hand in hand with our AID colleagues. And what I've seen in the field is this $40 billion that you keep hearing this number. It sounds like a huge amount of money. It is a huge amount of money, but it's less than 1% of the U.S. national budget is spent on USAID, the State Department, and the Peace Corps, and all of our assistance programs combined. Less than 1%. There are fewer people in USAID and in the State Department than there are in just one of the military services. As a matter of fact, there are fewer State Department people than there are musicians in the U.S. military, bands, choirs, and orchestras. I kid you not. And if that is not a priority for us to fund as a country, then shame on us. We are the wealthiest country in the history of humankind. And we have a duty, but also a responsibility to our citizens to invest in the rest of the world. And that's what AID is an investment. It is not a handout. It is not charity. It is an investment. It's an investment, first and foremost, in our own security. It's an investment in not fighting the war that will be more expensive. It's an investment in making sure the immigrants who are fleeing conflict are taking care of where they are, so they don't either have to leave their country or leave their region, and that the countries who are handling these large displacements of populations, 117 million people displaced around the world, 39.7 million of whom are displaced into another country. A third of those are in 5 countries, none of which are the United States. We want those people to be able to stay near where they came from so that they can go back. We want to stabilize their countries where they came from so they can go back. Immigration is a big issue for a reason, but not for the same reason that we're tearing down AID. It's also an investment in economic development. It's an investment in our own country. I just want to quickly note that $28.9 billion of that $40 billion of AID goes into U.S. businesses with whom we partner on public-private partnerships like Land O'Lakes and Culligan Water. If anybody's interested, I'll tell you those stories from Rwanda. But also farmers. We buy most of our commodities for humanitarian assistance from U.S. farmers, providing a $15 billion market for U.S. farm products, as well as universities, research, vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. So these are investments to the tune of $441 million in Vermont alone that make a difference in our own community. So this is investing smartly in our own security by investing in others. That's my experience with AID. I'd like to turn to Dan quickly to ask about his experience with AID from the health perspective, which is so important. We've heard so much about disease surveillance, epidemic control, et cetera, and your deep expertise in this area.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you, Director Holt, Don Terry, everyone online. I believe there's perhaps 300 people online, so thank you for joining us, as well as a full room here of about 51 people. I was counting you as you came in. So very briefly, I've been very fortunate to be able to work short-term with and for USAID on infectious disease trips overseas, so mostly bird flu, the same H5N1 that we are hearing about now in the United States, in Indonesia in 2008, and then led a USAID team to Cairo, to Egypt in 2011, and then Ebola-related issues in Uganda, and then 2017 plague pneumonia in Madagascar. And it was really an honor and privilege to work with USAID colleagues, many of whom were not American. Some were American, but the majority were not American. They were in-country colleagues that we worked with. And another very big part of the infectious disease portfolio, as I understand, of USAID, is HIV work. And they've done, and until very recently, maybe 2 weeks ago, have continued to do really not only life-saving, but life-changing work across the world in the HIV pandemic. And with the HIV pandemic, there's also a second pandemic, and that's tuberculosis, which is a bacteria that's contagious through the air. HIV, as you know, is a virus not contagious through the air. But the two, TB and HIV, go hand in hand. And because of the stop work, stop funding order from the current administration, there's basically, in my view, 100% likelihood that there will be tuberculosis bacteria that's resistant to current treatments and HIV virus that's resistant to current treatments. You can say, well, it's over there, but as we all know, someone anywhere in the world, including from the United States, gets on a plane and goes over there, or someone that comes from outside the United States comes here, and then the problem is here as well. The last thing I just want to say in the remaining minute is that today, during a class that we had, some students here from the Masters in Public Health program here at the medical school at Geisel, we had a guest speaker, two guest speakers who are colleagues, friends of mine from the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, one of whom has been working for about 20 or 25 years in Uganda on HIV-related issues, and she was speaking from Kampala, from Uganda. And she said the effect of stopping work and funding, USAID and PEPFAR, is life-shattering. Many children will be born to mothers who have HIV infection, who will have HIV now because their mothers no longer had access to HIV medications. So the impact of what's happened in Washington is felt around the world. It's devastating immediately to many individual people and to societies. And just on a personal note, I think that in a way, what's been done is anti-humanitarian, and the animosity that's going to be generated and built will be very significant towards the U.S. government, the current U.S. government, and unfortunately towards some individuals as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we'll go to one of our first speakers who's up on our screen. Sarah, you have worked with AID at a very senior level. I understand that AID operates in roughly 130 countries around the world. I remember you're on the board of the Dickey Center, and one time you had to call us from Tigray in Ethiopia, and you made a real effort to do so. So could you tell us a little bit about what your role at AID has been, what you think works, where you think reform might be useful and necessary, and what your thoughts are on the current debate? Thanks. Over to you.
Sure. And maybe just to kick us off, for those that aren't aware, AID has a very simple mission that is very difficult in practice, which is to deliver a free, peaceful, and prosperous world on behalf of the American people, or to work towards those aims. And that mission really comes from Congress. And our top line guidance always came from Congress, working with new administrations on particular priorities. And of course, the priorities of ambassadors and host governments in any given country, but first and foremost from the people's representatives in Congress. And I'm really looking forward to Tim's reflections on kind of how far off track we are right now. I actually led a somewhat unique part of aid in that our funding was largely unearmarked. I led the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, which was actually a Trump era reform to create that bureau, to bring together what had been the Office of Food for Peace, a program that actually predates the creation of USAID, a program to use US sourced commodities, as Erica was talking about, sourced from farmers here in the United States to address hunger issues around the world. Bring that together with the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance in order to have more coherent humanitarian policies. So that was really a reform that was spearheaded by Trump's first aid administrator, Mark Green, again, working very closely with Congress. And I think a reform that made aid stronger and made our work overseas stronger. The humanitarian side of USAID in any given year, the budget is about between $9 and $12 billion a year. It's grown dramatically. Really a reflection again from Congress of the challenges that are facing the world and the role that the U.S. plays in addressing those challenges. That's about a third of aid's budget in any given year. That $40 billion figure has been batted around a lot, but that $40 billion figure in the last couple of years has been heavily inflated by direct budget support to Ukraine, which is kind of passed through USAID, but not largely programmed by USAID. So the humanitarian work is about a third of aid's budget. Another third of aid's budget is for global health. More than a third of aid's budget is for global health programming. So when you hear the disinformation and misinformation about the things aid is doing in the world, keep in mind that, again, the vast majority of what aid does in the world is respond to global health threats and challenges and humanitarian assistance around the world. That's everything from rapid onset disasters like the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, catastrophic flooding in Sudan, in Pakistan. I saw firsthand how the U.S. government response, led by USAID in those two contexts, really helped reopen closing diplomatic channels. These were areas where the relationship with both of those governments was incredibly frayed. And our disaster response helped reopen both mill channels and diplomatic channels in ways that redounded to U.S. national security. We also had responses over the last several years to complex emergencies, civil war in Sudan, obviously the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both direct humanitarian assistance in Ukraine, but as significantly, the impact of Russia's war in Ukraine on global food security around the world. Again, I think Congress recognized the destabilizing impact that the global food security crisis could have in areas, as far afield as Egypt, as Somalia, as Southern Africa. And so, again, responded with increased resources to respond to that global food security crisis, both for humanitarian reasons, for stability reasons, and also, frankly, to help keep together the coalition that the U.S. was really leading along with Europe in support of Ukraine and in opposition to Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And then, a smaller but as consequential piece of the work are investments in reducing the impact of disasters in the future. So everything from tsunami early warning systems, famine early warning systems, working with really being the belly button for all of U.S. science to support national weather services around the world who are able to forecast and predict in ways that help prevent the loss of life from disasters. And under the Biden administration, did a lot of work to increase our investments in climate resilience. But of course, I think anyone who's worked at USAID could give you a long list of reforms that could and should be implemented. And I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer. But I do want to put a plug in for, as we're kind of taking stock of this moment, one of the things that makes USAID, has made USAID so unique in the world is not just the size of our assistance, but the operational nature of USAID as a donor. We really are unique, particularly as DFID, the former UK development agency, has kind of collapsed in the last 4 or 5 years as it's been folded into the Foreign Office there. AID is really unique among its peers in being an operational donor, having presence all over the world, deploying with disaster assistance response teams into emergencies. And that direct connection with people on the ground makes our influence much greater. It makes our assistance smarter. It also redounds to the benefit, again, of U.S. national security in ways that are both anticipated and not necessarily anticipated. AID staff are often the only ones among the U.S. Civilian community that have relationships outside of elite capital circles. And so, in Colombia, when you had the Petro government come to power, it was the senior leaders of the AID mission that knew the people coming into his government and made those connections for diplomatic colleagues, again, for any number of priorities in Ethiopia. Even when relationships with Abe were at its lowest, AID maintained relationships in different ministries and at different levels of government that helped with negotiation on any number of issues. And as Dan spoke so eloquently about the role of AID in disease prevention, it's not just those programs that are surveilling disease. It's not just the investments in research, which are, of course, important. But most governments don't necessarily want to publicize that they are hosting infectious diseases, whether it's avian flu, because it will lead to culling of herds, or Ebola, because you'll see a crash in tourism or private sector investments. The relationships that AID health staff, many of them national staff, but also foreign service officers have developed over the years, again, help smooth and create a level of transparency in many of these places that we will inevitably lose if it's allowed for all of these AID missions to be dismantled around the world. And then, if you'll indulge me with one last thing, again, I think anyone who's worked at AID could give you a long list of needed reforms. Happy to talk about that. But if it's not abundantly clear to those that are listening, what we're seeing right now is not a good faith effort at reform. This is a smash operation, possibly pick up the pieces later, but really an all-out assault on the idea of soft power, on the idea that the U.S. has a role in promoting a free, peaceful, and prosperous world, with an emphasis on free. I think, the first programs that have not only been paused, but have been dismantled and canceled are programs in the democracy, rights, and labor space. And we've seen autocrats from Georgia, Myanmar, Serbia, Russia, China, swoop in, seize on the language of Trump and Elon Musk. In some cases, in the case of Georgia, demand from Elon Musk a list of AID partners, open investigations into our partners. I mean, this is being cheered by despots around the world, and certainly is not in service of our national security or our national interest.
Great. So, Jeremy, I'd like to turn to you next. You have focused your academic work on making our assistance programs more efficient, and that's something that's being talked about a lot. Could you just give us briefly kind of a sense of what that looks like and how that should work, and the kind of work that you've done in the past to make our assistance more efficient?
Great. Thanks so much. Wonderful to be with you all this evening. So let me say a few words. I think many folks probably know USAID works with an extensive group of contractors and nonprofit organizations to implement the kinds of projects and programs that Sarah was just talking about. And so I sit within that community. I currently work for an academic research center based at UC Berkeley And we had the, I think, unique position of having received just a few months ago a large multi-year grant from USAID that was designed to help the agency overall better collect evidence and use evidence in policymaking, designed to improve effectiveness, improve efficiency, and particularly take advantage of the broader movement throughout the aid community to do more with cost effectiveness analysis, thinking about from the wide menu of options that we might have in health or education or other sectors, which of those investments are the best bets in terms of returning results, with the amount of money available to spend. So I think we naively thought back in early January, before all of this began, that maybe we would be spared from some of the potential effects of the administration change, since we have this mission of working to make things more effective and efficient. And we certainly have watched with tremendous dismay what's happened since. And I think I and my colleagues all share Sarah's concern that we're not being asked to help implement reforms that might make the agency more effective, but we're seeing an attempt to demolish the agency overall. So I'll say a couple things about, what this world looked like before January 24th, when we received, like all of the other organizations working with USAID, a stop work order, and basically we've put down everything that was in progress since then. So USAID works with a number of organizations to provide research and evaluation services. I've worked with several of those, including the organization that I'm part of now. And there is a kind of routine procedure to identify projects and conduct evaluations designed to study in one way or another what's working and provide recommendations that can help make those projects more effective and improve other similar projects throughout the USAID portfolio. I will say one of the challenges that I've observed in my work is that oftentimes there isn't enough time or money or space for evidence to feed its way into program making. I think that probably is more true in some areas than others. Health and education, I think humanitarian assistance, there's a pretty well-established evidence base and set of interventions that have been vetted and are known to be effective. In democracy, rights, and governance, which is the area I've had most direct contact with, a lot of the interventions are less well studied, less well understood, and I think there's a bigger need and a bigger role for doing more research and evaluation work there. But as I said, and I think anyone within USAID would readily admit that sometimes decisions are made too quickly, sometimes the bureaucracy gets in the way of doing our best work. Sometimes we would like to have more time to collect evidence and use it in policymaking. But there was, I think, a very sincere effort underway to try to shift that dynamic. And so one of the things that the prior administrator did was create the Office of the Chief Economist, staffed by a very prominent development economist, Dean Carlin, who was starting to work through a set of initiatives, including putting more money into the kinds of research that my organization was sort of chomping at the bit to be able to provide. So more work using rigorous randomized evaluations, more work, as I already said, using cost effectiveness analysis, and more investment in synthesizing bodies of evidence to feed into policy making. All of that's on hold. I can say from the perspective of the organization I work with, we're not terribly hopeful that that will be restarted. We haven't received official notices canceling the USAID awards that we have, but we're making plans to move on without those funds with great dismay. So I guess the last thing that I would say is, from the kind of broader research and academic community that has partnered with USAID in various ways for decades, the real hope first is that aid will survive in some form, but whatever form it survives in, that there will be a role for continuing to build on some of this recent momentum to build evidence and use evidence in policymaking.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. That's quite helpful. I'm going to turn to Tim Rieser next, but I'll tell the audience we're going to turn to you after this next intervention. So please be ready if you've got questions. So Tim Rieser, I know you from Washington. You are famous as equal opportunity oversight from Capitol Hill, Republicans, Democrats, NGOs, the executive branch. You are famous for insightful and tough questions because you have such, I think, over 30 plus years of experience in the role of understanding and helping appropriators make policy choices around foreign assistance and foreign operations. So perhaps you could give us your perspective, both on the way you see oversight and also how you see the current moment.
Okay. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
So I think Erica and Sarah and others have given a great, and Jeremy, summary of the calamity which has befallen USAID in the last several weeks. I'll give you a bit of background about the Congress. As many Americans don't know, but I'll at least describe briefly, all the funds that USAID and the State Department and other federal agencies use to carry out programs originates from the Congress and from the Appropriations Committee that I worked for under Senator Leahy for over 35 years. And that committee is actually traditionally a very bipartisan committee, because unlike other committees that argue about everything, at the end of the day, if we don't agree, then funding for the government stops and the government shuts down. And so there's a tendency of people who work for the Appropriations Committee to actually believe in democracy and in compromise and in the need to reach agreement. And so we work as a team, Republicans and Democrats, and our goal is for each subcommittee, and the subcommittee that I work for, as was described, funds the budget for the State Department, for USAID and the Peace Corps, and quite a few other smaller agencies that implement foreign policy around the world. Our goal is to end up at the end of the year with a foreign policy that's not a Republican foreign policy or a Democratic foreign policy, but an American foreign policy. And that invariably involves a lot of give and take and compromises. And yet, I think if you walked in the room when we negotiate all the many ways in which the legislation in the House and the legislation in the Senate for the coming fiscal year differ, and there are usually thousands of areas of points in disagreement, ranging from the placement of a comma to billions of dollars, you would have a hard time knowing who the Republicans and who the Democrats are in the room. Because we all have different skills, different perspectives, we all work for different people, but our goals are essentially the same, and that is to come up with outcomes that everyone can ultimately feel that they got enough to convince their side to support. And that is the way it has worked traditionally. And so many of us have traveled to many parts of the world. We've seen, along with members of Congress who have seen the work of USAID, and invariably, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, have been impressed and encouraged by the work that USAID's staff around the world do in some of the most difficult and dangerous places. And it's just ironic today that here we have people who know nothing about USAID, have probably never seen a program that USAID supports, may not have met anyone who actually works for USAID, and under the pretext of a, quote, review, are, as I think Jeremy said, destroying the agency. There is no review going on. There's nothing that's being done to consult with the people who actually know something, and that is those from AID who are stationed overseas in these missions carrying out programs. And you don't conduct a review by shutting down the agency, freezing all the funds, putting everyone out of work, and reducing the staff from several tens of thousands to a few hundred. The result of this is that whether you talk to Republican staff or Democratic staff in the Appropriations Committee, they are all universally appalled by what is happening. And yet, what had been a tradition of consultation and regular communication and briefings and discussions with the different agencies that we have responsibility to fund, in this case, USAID, none of that is happening. There's been a total breakdown in meaningful oversight or communication because we don't know who to deal with. We don't know what they're doing. None of them know anything about the work that we do. And so what you have is an extreme level of frustration and really just disgust as far as how this is being carried out. There are a lot of things wrong with AID, as there are with the Congress and every other agency of the federal government. As was mentioned, I've worked to get the money for USAID over the years, sometimes in the face of efforts by one administration or another to fold it into the State Department or to otherwise undermine USAID's mission. And I think that, you know, what we're seeing today is unlike anything in at least my experience. And the consequences for the United States are almost impossible to overstate. The work that USAID does is not just about responding to humanitarian crises or preventing conflict or responding to conflict or trying to help people in countries whose governments are corrupt and abusive. It's to build relationships with the people of other countries, other societies, and in doing so, try to promote a more stable world. And so, you know, I think that today it's anyone's guess how this is going to turn out. We're all trying very hard to convince the administration that if they're serious about finding ways to make USAID a more efficient and effective agency, that's something we can actually work on together. We have a lot of experience. We know some of the things that need to be improved. There's a lot that AID does that I've at times felt was not very sustainable, not really realistic. But when you look overall at what this agency does on behalf of the American people and the country, it's just impossible to comprehend why this would be happening. So the Congress is at least the Democrats were in a rather weak position. We're in the minority. We can complain. We can try to get the administration to talk to us. But ultimately, as you see, the only branch of the government that's been able to put the brakes on so far are the federal courts. And we have no idea where that will lead to. But I have to say, it's hard to be optimistic when you have an administration that doesn't even seem to care what the law is, what Congress thinks, or even necessarily what the courts say. So to summarize, you know, the situation has broken down badly. It has caused a lot of anger on the part of not just Democrats, but also Republicans, at least at the staff level. Unfortunately, you know, on the Republican side, it seems that even if they privately agree with us, at the end of the day, they always vote in support of whatever President Trump wants. So we don't really have good interlocutors at this time. And all we can do is try to use what legislative means we have to slow this process down and hopefully convince Secretary Rubio and others that the consequences of what they're doing will be hugely damaging and very difficult to reverse.
Thank you very much, Tim. I really appreciate you laying that out for us. All right, let me look out at the audience. I think I see some hands. We've got Prescott here in the middle. Why don't we take some questions? And then over here on the side.
Hi, thank you all for being here today. So some of the attacks on USAID coming from DOGE and the White House have focused on grant funding for DEI, theater, and arts-based initiatives. So from your experiences, what are the vetting and grant approval processes for USAID and for assistance look like? And what is the impact of these art and culture-based projects?
Thanks very much. Hey, Sarah, did you hear the question? It's, just to paraphrase, what's the process for making decisions about grants, and what about the criticism about DEI and some other sort of value inappropriate programs? Is that fair? Okay. Sarah, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about how grants are approved through AID?
Sure. I mean, I think first, maybe big picture is I hope that Dartmouth students are savvy enough, and I'm not suggesting that this question wasn't, because I think there's always a grain of truth. I hope you're savvy enough to be very critical of what you're hearing from DOGE and from Elon Musk. I mean, even in the Oval Office last Tuesday, Elon Musk admitted that, oh, that story about $50 million for condoms for Hamas, it wasn't true. Mistakes were made. Mistakes will be made. I mean, there is just a flood of information and disinformation that has been put out and repeated by Musk, by Trump, and by the right-wing echo chamber. Some of it originating with Russian disinformation campaigns, which has been hostile to aid for decades. So to take with a grain of salt, a huge number of the projects that have been identified, on the Republicans' list of kind of shame from USAID have not actually been USAID programs. They've been public affairs programs coming out of embassies around the world, programmed by the State Department. So again, take with a huge grain of salt what you're hearing. And some of them, when you dig beneath the surface, one in Uganda supporting LGBTQ youth there that has gotten some attention. This is a country where to be gay, to be homosexual is a death sentence. And so AID provided support to individuals that were facing persecution by their government. And you can have a policy conversation about whether that is or is not the appropriate use of foreign assistance dollars. I think in this last administration, it was seen as an appropriate use of foreign assistance dollars. This administration could have come in and made different decisions about how to use and prioritize foreign assistance dollars. But by and large, again, with the exception of the humanitarian assistance, by and large, almost every dollar that aid programs is both earmarked and has to be notified to Congress, which means Congress is informed, Congress gets an opportunity to weigh in. And on very rare occasions, the Trump administration certainly blew through some congressional holds. The Biden administration also blew through a handful of congressional holds. But by and large, the agency does not program without at least the kind of acquiescence of its authorizing and appropriating committees. Tim can speak more to that as well. But these programs, they're picking kind of the most salacious titles. Again, some of them totally fabricated, some being spun to great effect in a media echo chamber. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sarah. That's really helpful. I think we've got another question over here. The gentleman in the white cap.
Hello. I first wanted to express my gratitude for all of you being here and discussing such a timely and pressing issue in United States history. So thank you so much. My question is in regards to the points that Sarah and Jeremy made. And so this idea of the mission being championed of aid to be that of advocating for a free, peaceful, and prosperous world. Given the current standing of the United States, where protests are being carried out daily to oppose the current administration, if aid were to survive this challenging time in its organization, as Jeremy suggests, how can we, as a country, have other countries that we are relying on this aid to invest in them kind of take us seriously if, in theory, us as a country are not practicing what we're preaching to the countries we're offering aid to?
That is a great question. Is there anybody on the panel who wants to, could everybody hear the question? I think so. Does anyone want to take that one? Erica?
Tim, I'm turning to you because you've been a champion for good governance and at lost causes, but also good governance. And I've worked with you on democracy and human rights and good governance support. And I mean, this really is about building trust, as you said, in relationships. And you're the expert on this.
Well, I don't know if I'm the expert, but I think that the question is really relevant because we often try to set an example for other countries, and we sometimes fail at that. And as a result, our credibility is damaged, and our ability to influence other governments and to convey to those who are trying to support that we will, in fact, stick with them and support them is undermined. So I think, one of the things that we have to do is try to be consistent and to stand up for what we believe in, and to whether it's a country like Syria that is abusing its own people, or a country that's an ally of ours like Egypt that is doing the same. It seems to at least those who I've worked for, Senator Leahy and Senator Welch and other offices, that we that if we're going to stand for the principles that we say we do, then we have to act when countries, regardless of whether they're our adversaries or our partners, deny basic rights to their own people. I think that when it comes to USAID, I think, at least for those of us who have spent a lifetime looking at what USAID does and trying to ensure that the programs that we support and the way that it uses funds from Congress is consistent with our intent. Overall, we have continued to support USAID and give it the resources it needs because we think that it does a pretty darn good job. Not perfect, and there are certainly examples, and some of them have been pointed out by the current administration that, whereas I think Sarah did a great job of debunking in many ways much of the criticism that's been leveled at USAID. If you actually look behind what these programs are, often you find that it's exactly what USAID should be doing or that the US government should be supporting, but sometimes not. So our job in the Congress is to try to do the best job we can to ensure that the programs that are being carried out are consistent with what we intended. But the Congress is a complicated place, and there's 100 senators, each of whom has a different idea of what the world should look like, and 435 House members. And so, some programs have support from some sides, others from others, and our job is kind of to be the referee.
All right. Thank you so much. I think, do we have a hand back here? We also have two down here.
And we have quite a few online.
Okay. I think I see Professor Valentino here had a question, and then the gentleman here in the blue. You right? Yeah, wait for the microphone.
Judith, all the way down here, all the way in the front. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks to everyone on the panel. I'm Ben Valentino. I'm a professor in the government department here. Nice to see all of you. I think I know pretty much all of you. I've met you before. My question is about kind of, how we got here and whether we can expect anything to change in the future. And a lot of that, I think, ultimately depends on the American people asking for a change, asking for us to not do what's just happened. And I spent a little bit of time while you were all talking, looking at what public opinion polls have been done since the funding was cut from USAID. And the polls aren't good. A majority of Americans support the cuts that were made. That includes a majority of independents, so not obviously a majority of Democrats, but a majority of Republicans and independents say they support the cuts that were made. Majority of Americans don't think the United States should be involved in the democracy promotion business. As you go through a list of the things that USAID does, a majority say they don't like those things. And this shouldn't be, I think, a surprise. We've known from these polls that we've seen about American aid programs that they're not popular with the American people for a long time, and often based on misunderstandings and misinformation, as we heard from the panelists, but that's been true for a very long time. We haven't managed to correct those incorrect beliefs among the American people. And partly, I think it didn't matter because no administration was inclined to use that public opinion against these agencies that every American administration understood was doing what the United States needed to do. But now we have such an administration, and the bulwark against that has to be the American public. So I guess my question is ultimately, whose job is it, because we haven't managed it so far, to convince the American public that these programs are good for the country, that they do need them, that it doesn't take 25% of our federal budget to fund them, and all the other myths and disinformation that's out there. I mean, I think this is mainly directed at Tim, because I think probably the Democratic Party has its work cut out for it here. But if anyone else wants to comment, I'd love to hear that.
All right. Well, thank you. Before we go to our panel, could you pass the mic forward? I think we'll take a second question before we do the response. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you so much for coming and talking on this. So you had talked about how America
Just
was...
pull the microphone a little closer so we can hear you.
Sorry. About how America was the most generous provider of foreign aid in the world. But with the current actions toward USAID being so detrimental towards U.S. soft power, do you see other countries such as China taking advantage of this to perhaps fill this gap in foreign aid in a similar manner to what the U.S. has been doing, perhaps for their own foreign policy interests, especially in places where USAID was a major diplomatic factor?
All right. Very good. So why don't we take those questions and then we can go to our online audience. Tim, you got name checked by Ben Valentino but then I'll turn to some of the other panelists.
It's a long source of frustration.
For those of us who work to provide the resources for USAID, that there's this myth that it amounts to a large percentage of the federal budget, which it doesn't. It's a minuscule amount, relatively speaking, to the challenges that USAID confronts in the world. And anyone who travels to the kinds of places where USAID works sees that immediately, that invariably they are woefully underfunded to try to deal with the magnitude and complexity of the problems that exist in these countries. So there is a terribly frustrating lack of information on the part of the public, who has this idea that the work that AID does amounts to 15 or 20% of the federal budget. If we had 2%, I would be happy. It's a mere fraction of that. And so despite our efforts over the years, and not just us, but many organizations and campaigns, this continues to be the situation. And if anyone has any good ideas about how to educate the American public more effectively in why this matters to us as a country and to the world more broadly, I would be happy to hear, because it's been an issue for us over many years, and we don't seem to be making any real progress. And so as a result, outsiders who know nothing about USAID, the mission, the people, the importance, can come in a matter of a few weeks, shut it all down, and destroy the professional careers of thousands of people. I mean, the consequences are going to be felt years from now, but that is the dilemma that we face, and the polls reflect that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, maybe Dan, I could turn to you for a moment because you work in such concrete areas of disease, infectious disease. Do you think either there's a way to talk to the American people about it, or to this gentleman's question about will other countries sort of come in and step into that void for positive or negative purposes if we are not there?
So I'll take the second one because it's easier. The answer is yes. And I can say with regard to the country that you mentioned in particular, China, just from my own limited, very narrow experience, working during outbreaks overseas, it's probably part of the larger China's Belt and Road Initiative, but they do have a sort of a, it's not directly analogous, but it's similar to, and perhaps even modeled on, the U.S. Agency for International Development. So there's a Chinese analog, and I've seen in outbreaks, for example, working in Sierra Leone in August of 2014 during Ebola in Freetown, where information about Ebola appeared in Chinese and in English being spoken in Sierra Leone. And in other outbreaks in Madagascar, plague pneumonia outbreak, 2017, September, October, where there were actually tents and other facilities, healthcare facilities, that had the logo of the Chinese foreign assistance. I don't know the exact name of what it was called, but it reminded me of the logo of USAID, to be honest. And I do have colleagues, and some of whom are friends from in China, working since I've been working since 2003, and I went to China during the severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, and almost every year since then to Hong Kong and other places, Beijing and Guangzhou, and working with colleagues. And I think it's in their national interest to fill in as USAID is no longer allowed to work.
All right. Well, if anybody you've had to be a diplomat, Erica, and represent the United States. Many of us have worked in foreign affairs. We're not usually trained to talk to broader audiences. Do you have any reflections on answering Ben Valentino's question about how to talk to the American people?
Well, one of the things, and Tim, I'm going to tag you again here because you and I have talked about this a long time ago. One of the things that actually inhibits our ability to get the story out to the American population is something called the Hatch Act. We are not allowed to do public diplomacy in the United States to try and influence U.S. public opinion. We're prohibited by law from doing that. And so therefore, we can provide information on our websites and things like that, but we cannot try and influence U.S. opinion. And there's a very fine line there. And it prohibits us, because our lawyers keep us, the State Department, us, USAID, and the development agencies, as well as Peace Corps, from doing the kind of outreach that you see from the military. Flyovers, public affairs events all over the place, right? We are actually prohibited by law from doing that. So if Congress would get rid of that provision and let us do public opinion, then that might allow us to change things. But it's there for a good reason, because we're not supposed to be doing influence operations in our own country. But again, this isn't understood or explained very well. And so we rely on others throughout the U.S. government, including the military, who has in the past been very clear. If you do not give more money to the State Department and AID, you have to buy me more bullets, and it's much more expensive to buy more bullets. If you are promoting peace, that's what AID and the State Department and Peace Corps are all about. The military is there to defend and deter. They don't want to go out and have to fight a war. How do you prevent wars from happening in the first place? Promoting peace, prosperity, and freedom. We know this. This is not rocket science, but it is that essential partnership. And yes, to your question, China will step in. Absolutely. Russia isn't capable of stepping in, and they're not interested in stepping in. In a lot of ways, they'll try, but they won't be as capable of doing it. But China absolutely will. Let me give you one example. Culligan Water, my example from Rwanda. We, with my USAID mission, through a partnership, a public-private partnership, provided a survey about how to provide clean water for the city of Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, where about a third of the population of the country lives. The water was horrible. I had to have a distiller in my house. It was the largest source of disease in the country other than malaria. And we, through this very small grant, did a feasibility study for the city of Kigali about how to install a clean water plant. That feasibility study was paid for in part by Culligan Water, who had expertise in very turbid, i.e. muddy water. And they had a lot of weird chemicals in their water from factories and things like that. So we did the study. That helped Culligan Water get their foot in the door. Through a $10,000 grant, they won a $300 million award, which created 500 jobs in Illinois, which grew into 1,000 jobs in Illinois because that was their first investment ever in Africa, and it turned into an investment in 13 different countries in Africa. And we beat out the Chinese because we provided $10,000 in a small health study on clean water. This is the kind of investment that we want to make in partnership through these kind of programs. And if we don't make them, the Chinese sure as heck will.
All right, well, thank you very much. I think we've got an online audience. Should we go back here? Noah, do you want to read out one of the questions?
Yeah, is it okay if I read out two?
Why don't you do two? That sounds great.
So one participant asks, some Latin American presidents, for example, the president of Mexico and El Salvador, have responded positively to the closing of USAID because of its history of being used to fund political opposition groups and for not being transparent in the past. Can you comment on those perspectives? And a second question, in your opinion, what's the best way to reverse a decision to defund USAID, negotiate with the Trump team, mount a frontal assault, design a new model funded by the private sector, or something else?
All right, excellent. So the first on support to political opposition. Jeremy, I don't want to leave you out of this conversation. I don't know if that's part of your oversight mechanism, but also Sarah, I think you probably have heard this complaint and dealt with this kind of challenge in your role at AID. So would either of you like to try that question or the second one, which is, where do we go from here?
I'll just say a few words and then turn over to you, Sarah. And, in the spirit of the question about Latin America, it certainly is true that USAID has and was funding programs in places like El Salvador that government leaders found inconvenient. So things like providing support to independent media or to civil society groups or human rights groups. The space for that work in El Salvador was very minimal, Nicaragua, very minimal. So oftentimes there wasn't a tremendous amount of that work, but at other times in other countries that's been more extensive. And, the reactions you're seeing, I think, are just a reflection of how autocrats or aspiring autocrats around the world would prefer not to have to deal with restraints on their power and organizations that would like to hold them to account. So, it's very troubling to me that we're seeing those kinds of reactions. It reaffirms all of the reasons why lots of folks, myself included, think that work is important.
Thanks so much. Sarah, could we ask you to jump in here?
I mean, I think in terms of what comes next, I think the fight to kind of save what is still ongoing. And so far we've seen some action from the courts, temporary restraining orders to prevent the firing of certain categories of USAID staff, although already a lot of aid is heavily dependent on contractors because its staffing footprint was frozen for many years. But I think there are large efforts. I've certainly been involved in supporting some of them to push back through litigation and in the courts. But I think we have to recognize that we have an administration that's hostile to the agency. And so even if there should be success in the courts, I think you're going to see a much diminished role under this administration for productive foreign assistance. And there are some efforts starting to identify what are the kind of global public goods that aid has been supporting. Are there some of those that can be picked up by other actors, either in the short term or long term? But I think it's a mistake to think that there's a substitute for the US government doing this work. Again, particularly when it comes not just to the funding, but to the relationships, to the presence, to the type of work that aid, foreign service officers, foreign service national staff have been doing for years to really understand the countries that we work in and that we partner with.
Thanks so much. Did we have one more question from online? Because we're closing in on time here, so.
Yes, thank you. Another question. Does the defunding of USAID, signal a movement to a position of isolationism for the U.S. in the manner of the period between the two world wars?
That is a very large question to maybe finish off with here. Would any of our panelists like to reflect on whether this will lead us into a period of greater isolation, either as a singular policy or one that's a larger view of how the U.S. should be in the world? Well, maybe we could, is that you, Tim?
Well, I think any of us could probably comment on
yeah,
that.
absolutely.
I mean,
we have invested in USAID missions and people and programs for decades to build relationships, to enable the United States to engage with other countries and people all over the world in representing our interests, in protecting our interests. And so if all of those missions and people are closed down and brought home and programs shut down, yes, of course. I mean, obviously, a major consequence would be that we're not nearly as visible, as engaged, and able to represent the American people overseas, as whether it's in global health, in supporting civil society organizations that are risking their lives to report on the actions of corrupt and abusive governments, to you name it. And so, I wasn't around in the period between the First and Second World Wars, but I can say that certainly it is a trend towards isolationism and us pulling back and reducing significantly our engagement overseas.
Can I just add very briefly onto what Tim said? He said two very important words on behalf, or several important words on behalf of the American people. And that's what the sign from the American people is on every USAID project around the world. It's two hands clasping in friendship, reaching out to each other. And that's on behalf of you all. And you all have a role to play. And I don't want people to go away feeling discouraged, like saying, oh, it's all over and I have nothing to say. It's all up to the courts. Your representatives, the people who represent you in Congress are representing you. They're not representing themselves, they're representing you. Call them, tell them that you disagree if you disagree. Tell them you agree if you agree. But talk to your representatives and insist that they represent you and that they understand that misinformation and disinformation and this gotcha game out there is not what you expect from your Congress people, that you support them if they're doing the right thing or you're disagreeing if they are doing something that you disagree with. Because it's really important for them to hear from you. And if they don't hear from you, they'll assume that the public opinion poll that you're hearing, which those opinion polls are tiny, are the majority. And votes are turned, and I mean, Tim will speak to this more than anybody, votes are turned because they hear from their constituents. So please, play your role as part of this. You have an active role to play.
I think polls going back for generations find a conflict in that Americans think that we are paying 40% of our budget for assistance. They think we are the bulk of international peacekeepers. They think that we are involved in everything in the world. And while the U.S. is one of the greatest presence in the world and more embassies, or at least in the past,
we are.
The resources we've talked about today are relatively minuscule to what the American people believe it may be. So there's a tension between that American generosity and that concern that too much is going overseas. So in a way, this conversation is how do we bring those realities together with a very generous spirit in the United States about humanitarian support, medical relief, and concern for the world, but not out of balance with taking care of ourselves and our citizens. So maybe as an optimist as well, it's a long overdue conversation. It'll take a long time to hear the stories from the countries around the world, the people around the world who also appreciate that partnership with us to come back. That sometimes can move the needle, but I worry that will take a while. But with that, let me turn over to Don Carey to close out our evening, but thank you all for joining in the fantastic questions as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our panelists and for not only laying out the legacy of USAID, the impact, but also some of the consequences with some of the future decisions coming up. And this is the start of the conversation. Please go and talk to everyone you know about this. There's so many folks who have no idea the impact of USAID in their own hometown. So I encourage you all to be part of the voice of change. Thank you so much.
Thank you.